Absolutely, here is a cinematic, emotional, heart-touching story designed for a YouTube narration, with the requested hooks, CTAs, suspense, and a complete ending in part 1. The night she lifted her shirt, I thought she was about to show me the reason everyone had abandoned her. Instead, she showed me the scars she had spent years hiding beneath oversized clothes, lowered eyes, and a smile that never reached her heart. Her hands trembled as she whispered, "No one wants me." For a few seconds, the room went completely silent. Then I stepped closer, looked directly into her frightened eyes, and said the words she had needed to hear for years. "I do." Her name was Hannah, and I met her on a rainy Thursday evening at a small community shelter on the edge of town. I had volunteered there for nearly 6 months, mostly helping with food deliveries, repairing broken furniture, and talking to people who simply needed someone to listen. I never imagined that one ordinary evening would change the way I understood loneliness forever. Hannah had been sitting alone at the end of a long table, carefully folding a paper napkin into smaller and smaller pieces. She looked to be around 30, with soft brown hair tied loosely behind her head and tired blue eyes that seemed to carry years more sadness than her age should have allowed. She wore a loose gray sweater despite the room being warm, and whenever someone walked past her, she instinctively pulled the fabric tighter around herself. If you believe everyone deserves kindness, dignity, and a second chance, please take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to Kindness Studio. Sometimes one small act of kindness can remind someone that their story isn't over. I first noticed Hannah because she dropped her spoon. It fell onto the floor with a tiny metallic sound, but instead of picking it up, she froze. A few people at the table glanced toward her, and I watched her face change. Her shoulders tightened as though she expected someone to laugh. I walked over, picked up the spoon, brought her another one, and quietly asked if she needed anything. She shook her head and whispered that she was fine. But she wasn't. I could see it immediately. Over the next few weeks, I learned small pieces of her story. She had once worked at a bakery and dreamed of opening a little cafe. She loved old movies, hated thunderstorms, and used to spend Sunday mornings cooking breakfast for her younger sister. But 3 years earlier, a terrible accident had changed everything. A gas explosion in the apartment building where she lived had left her with severe burns across part of her side and back. Her sister survived but moved away afterward, unable to cope with the memories. Hannah spent months in hospitals and rehabilitation centers. When she finally returned to normal life, she discovered something almost as painful as the physical recovery: people treated her differently. Some stared. Some asked intrusive questions. Others tried to hide their discomfort. A man she had dated before the accident slowly stopped answering her messages after seeing her scars. Another person told her she was too damaged to start a family. Eventually, Hannah stopped trying. She began wearing loose clothes, avoiding mirrors, avoiding crowds, and avoiding relationships altogether. She told herself that if nobody got close, nobody could reject her again. One evening, I found her sitting outside the shelter beneath a narrow awning while rain poured onto the street. She was holding an old photograph in both hands. It showed her standing behind a bakery counter, laughing beside a tray of freshly baked bread. She looked completely different in the picture, not because of her appearance, but because she looked free. She told me that she missed that woman. I told her that woman was still there. She shook her head. She said the person in the photograph didn't know what it felt like to be looked at with pity. She didn't know what it was like to wake up and wonder whether someone would stay after seeing her scars. She didn't know what it felt like to believe that love was something other people deserved. I didn't have a perfect answer. So I simply sat beside her. Sometimes people don't need advice. Sometimes they need someone willing to stay when the silence becomes uncomfortable. Weeks passed, and Hannah slowly began changing. She started helping in the shelter kitchen. At first, she only washed dishes. Then she began preparing simple meals. Eventually, she started baking again. The first time she pulled a tray of cinnamon rolls from the oven, the entire kitchen smelled like warm sugar and childhood memories. Everyone gathered around, and Hannah smiled for the first time without forcing it. But just when I thought she was beginning to heal, something happened that nearly destroyed her progress. A new volunteer accidentally saw one of her scars when her sweater shifted. The woman stared for a moment too long before looking away. Hannah noticed. That was enough. She disappeared from the kitchen and didn't return for 3 days. When I finally found her in a quiet room upstairs, she was sitting beside the window with her arms wrapped around herself. She told me she had decided to leave the shelter. She said she couldn't keep pretending she was strong. Then she whispered that she had never shown anyone the worst of her scars. Her voice broke. Slowly, with tears running down her cheeks, Hannah lifted the edge of her shirt just enough to reveal the extensive scar tissue along her side. It wasn't frightening to me. It was simply evidence of something she had survived. But Hannah looked at my face, waiting for the reaction she had seen so many times before. She whispered, "No one wants me." I stepped closer. I didn't reach for her. I didn't tell her that her scars were beautiful, because I knew that wasn't what she needed to hear. She needed to know that her worth had never depended on having perfect skin. So I looked into her eyes and said, "I do." She stared at me as though she hadn't understood. I told her I wanted her friendship. I wanted to know the woman behind the scars. I wanted to hear about her dreams, her terrible jokes, her favorite movies, and the cafe she still secretly dreamed about opening. I told her I wasn't promising some magical life where nobody ever stared or said cruel things. I was promising something simpler. I wouldn't walk away because she had scars. Hannah began crying so hard that she covered her face with both hands. Then she laughed through the tears. She told me nobody had ever answered her that way. That night wasn't the beginning of a perfect romance. It was the beginning of something much more important: trust. Over the following months, Hannah rebuilt her life one small decision at a time. She rented a tiny apartment. She returned to work at a bakery. She began speaking with her sister again. Eventually, she saved enough money to rent a small storefront. The sign above the door read, "Hannah's Table." On opening day, she stood outside holding a pair of scissors, trembling with nervousness. She looked at me and said she was terrified nobody would come. Then the first customer walked in. Then another. By noon, every table was full. Hannah stood behind the counter, watching strangers laugh, eat her cinnamon rolls, and compliment her cooking. For a moment, she touched the scar beneath her sleeve. Then she let her hand fall. She didn't hide it. Months later, she told me that the scars hadn't disappeared, but something inside her had changed. She no longer saw them as proof that she was unwanted. She saw them as proof that she had survived something that was supposed to destroy her. And perhaps that is what love and kindness really do. They don't erase the painful chapters of our lives. They simply teach us that those chapters don't get to write the ending. Hannah eventually became known in our town for giving free meals to anyone who couldn't afford one. She said she remembered what it felt like to believe she had nowhere to belong. Every Friday evening, she kept one table reserved for anyone eating alone. One day, I asked her why. She smiled and said, "Because somebody once sat beside me when I thought nobody would." If this story touched your heart, please don't just watch and move on. Like the video, share it with someone who might need these words, and subscribe to Kindness Studio. You never know whose life might be changed by a simple reminder that they are still worthy of love, friendship, dignity, and a second chance. And before we end, I have one special request. In the comments, write, "Everyone deserves a second chance." Not for Hannah, but for every person who has ever felt unwanted because of something they couldn't change. Because sometimes the person standing in front of us isn't asking to be rescued. They're simply asking us not to leave. And sometimes, the most powerful thing we can ever say to a broken heart is only 3 words. I do. Not because we can promise a perfect future, but because we are willing to stay long enough to help them believe in one. If you'd like, I can also create a YouTube SEO description, keywords, hashtags, disclaimer, and 3 to 5 related titles specifically matched to this story.